Good evening and welcome to the Wednesday night Bible class of the Boone Church of Christ. Faith and obedience. It's pretty difficult to separate those two words, isn't it? If we're faithful, then we're obedient. Often we understand why God commands something, don't we? It just makes sense. Don't take a life. Well, we all know that murder is wrong, so we understand why God commands that we respect life. Be fair and just in our dealings with others. Well, we would want that, so we understand God's commands in this area as well. In fact, most of God's commands are relatively easy for us to understand. But when it comes to fully being faithfully obedient, there is a challenge for us that may be difficult. What happens when we don't understand why God has commanded certain things? Does our response of faithful obedience to his word change? Listen to Isaiah chapter 55, verses 6 through 11. Seek the Lord while you can find him. Call on him now while he is near. Let the wicked change their ways and banish the very thought of doing wrong. Let them turn to the Lord that he may have mercy on them. Yes, turn to our God, for he will forgive generously. Notice right at the beginning of this passage, there is a call for the people to change. There's a call for them to change their ways. They're being wicked, God says, and they need to just stop even the very thought of doing wrong. Now, it's plausible that they didn't understand why it was that God was commanding them to do certain things. And the reason that I say that is because of this very next phrase. God says, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, says the Lord, and my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. See, God's telling them, you may not understand, but you need to trust me. I'm not you. My thoughts are much higher than your thoughts. I reason in ways that you can't even imagine. Then he goes on, the rain and the snow come down from the heavens and stay on the ground to water the earth. They cause the grain to grow, producing seed for the farmer and bread for the hungry. Well, why the switch here? He's talking about their sin. He's talking about how important it is that they trust him, that he is God. And then he starts talking about the rain and the snow and the seeds and the harvest. Why the switch? Well, it's the beginning of an analogy. And here is the analogy. It's explained in the second part of this. It is the same way with my word. I send it out, and it always produces fruit. It will accomplish all that I want it to, and it will prosper everywhere I send it. See, God doesn't just command something without a reason. He says, I'm sending my word out. It's going to produce what I want it to produce. It calls for us to make a decision about a change in our lives and to conform our will to his will. That's its purpose, and it will always accomplish that purpose because it will always cause us and compel us to make a decision either to accept him and his will or reject it. Will we always understand, though, why God commands a particular thing? Well, many times we will, but not always. Again, he says, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts. My ways are far beyond anything you can imagine. We won't always understand, but we are still expected to obey. Jesus taught this lesson, for example, to Peter on numerous occasions. One such time is when Jesus was washing the disciples' feet. Listen to John chapter 13, verses 6 through 9. This picks up where Jesus is approaching Peter. When Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? That wasn't so much of a question as it was a wall. It was a borderline warning to Jesus not to do this. He says, Lord, are you really thinking that you're going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you don't understand now what I am doing, but someday you will. Do you hear what he says to Peter? He acknowledges that Peter doesn't get why Jesus is doing this right now. He says, you're not going to understand it. You don't understand it now, but one day you're going to figure it out, Peter. You're going to be able to understand one day. But that wasn't good enough for Peter. He wanted to understand right now. So Peter protested, no, You will never, ever wash my feet. So Jesus gets a little more pointed with Peter. Unless I wash you, you won't belong to me. Simon Peter exclaimed, then wash my hands and my head as well, Lord, not just my feet. You know, this is a lesson that we have to learn as well. It is not easy to obey when we don't fully understand the reasoning behind the commandment. But it is absolutely vital that we obey anyway. God is God, and we are not. Abraham models this kind of faithful obedience in his life. That is why he is mentioned in that great chapter of faith in Hebrews 11. Let's read together Hebrews 11, verses 8 through 19. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith. For he was like a foreigner living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. And so a whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead, a nation with so many people, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there is no way to count them. All these people died still believing what God promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country where they can call their own. If they had longed for the country they came from, they could have gone back. But they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That is why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son Isaac, even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. You know, God called Abraham to do things that are difficult for us to understand. Certainly, they would have been difficult for Abraham as well. What challenges did Abraham have to overcome to obey God? As he was listening to this, what are some things that may not have computed? Well, Abraham obeyed when he didn't know where he was going. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as an inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. Abraham got up and left. He went on his way, didn't know where he was going. Why did he do it? By faith. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed. There is faithful obedience. Abraham obeyed when he didn't know how God's will would be accomplished. God willed that a child be born to Abraham and Sarah, even though Abraham was 75 and Sarah was barren. And it was not until Abraham was 100 years old, 25 years later, when Isaac was in fact born. Abraham obeyed when human understanding couldn't grasp how God's will was going to be accomplished. Abraham obeyed when he didn't know when God will fulfill his promises. Abraham obeyed when he didn't know why God was doing what he was doing. Why would God command him to sacrifice Isaac? It just didn't make any sense, at least not from a human perspective. But Abraham obeyed even when he didn't fully understand why God was doing what he was doing. Abraham was able to obey God without the specific information that most of us want to have before we do something. Abraham did not know the where, the how, the when, or the why of what God was commanding him, but he obeyed. Now, was Abraham perfect? Well, we know that he wasn't. Do you think he experienced anxiety, fear, doubts? I'm certain he would have. But still, he was faithful. Remember, faith isn't the absence of anxiety or fear. Rather, faith occurs in the midst of anxiety and fear and doubt. So how can we have faith when we don't fully understand God's commands? If we struggle with any of God's commands, we need to pause. And we need to really explore some things about our faith. For example, if we have to fully understand a command prior to obeying it, then where is our faith anyway? Is our faith in God, or is it in us? When we decide that we have to understand everything up front, then we're placing faith in ourselves. When we put our faith in ourselves, then we're saying that we trust in ourselves. We're saying that we trust in our understanding more than we trust in God's understanding. We're asserting that our level of knowledge is greater than God's level of knowledge. So if we ever find ourselves in this situation, it's probably wise to ask a few introspective questions such as these. First, if we are questioning God's commandments, have we tried to better understand God's character? Why would it be important for us to become familiar with God's character? It is so we can know the God behind the commandment. God has given us everything. Why has he done that? Well, he's done that because he loves us. And because he loves us, he wants to protect us. And he protects us so that he can continue to provide for us. That's who God is. He is love. And his love is what character is all about. So we have to consider that if we find ourselves questioning his commandments. Second, if we're questioning God's commands, have we reflected on our own flaws? We're influenced by the temptation to sin. We're tempted by the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. But God is not. He is different. What is God influenced by? He is motivated only by perfect love. Again, he's given us everything. Why? Because he loves us, and he wants a relationship with us more than we can imagine. This means that he is capable of a level of sacrifice that we can never achieve. Third, if we are questioning God's commands, have we studied to understand his faithfulness? We are routinely unfaithful to God, but he is always faithful to us. He has never once exhibited unfaithfulness. He is always faithful to his promises that he has made to us. And finally, if we are questioning God's commands, have we studied to understand God's wisdom? God has a perspective that we couldn't possibly imagine, that we couldn't possibly have. God's wisdom is far, far above our level of wisdom. God is giving us the benefit of his infinite wisdom, and he's asking us to trust him. And once more, he does this only because he loves us. We have to understand that God doesn't just command something without a reason. Now, we won't always understand, but as we've said, we are still expected to obey. And it isn't always easy to obey when we don't fully understand the reasoning behind the commandment. But it is absolutely vital that we do obey God anyway. Why? Because God is God and we are not. So if we find ourselves questioning a particular commandment of God's, we have to stop and reflect. We have to know that he always, always has our best interest at heart. Whether we're talking about God's commands regarding homosexuality, the sanctity of life, or any command that either we or our current culture struggles with, we have to trust that God is motivated only by love. If God loves us perfectly, and if his character and his wisdom and his faithfulness is perfect, then why not respond to him with faithful obedience? So let's make that choice today to surrender our hearts and our wills to God in faithful obedience.